Welcome. My name is John Farmer. I'm a law professor at Rutgers University, and I'm here today with Joshua M. Greene, whose book, Justice at Dachau, tells the story of the largest, yet perhaps least known war crimes trials in history. The Dachau trials were overshadowed in their time by the much more prestigious Nuremberg trials taking place 65 miles to the north. But it was at Dachau that men and women who actually ran the operation of Hitler's concentration camps were brought to justice. The chief prosecutor at Dachau was Colonel William Denson, a 32-year-old law professor from Birmingham, Alabama. The year after his death in 1998, Denson's widow approached Joshua with an astonishing cache of material her husband had been compiling for more than 50 years. This extraordinary archive formed the basis of Mr. Greene's book, released this past year in paperback by the American Bar Association. Joshua, welcome. Let me ask you, why, in your estimation, have so few people heard of the Dachau trials?
Well, the American way is to play up our successes, not our failures. And the Dachau trials showed how easy it is to betray due process for political reasons. Let me tell you the story briefly. By 1945 November, the Nuremberg trials are going on, and that's the prosecution and the parent trial of 22 men who were the chieftains, the policymakers of the Nazi Party. Where were all the other Nazis? There were more than 250,000 automatic arrestees in the American zone of liberation. About 60,000 of those were held over for trial on the grounds of former concentration camp Dachau. The others were denazified, basically made to fill out a questionnaire and sent on their merry way. At Dachau is where the U.S. government held their commissions. We call them tribunals today.
So there's so many really riveting moments in your book, but was there one outstanding moment in the course of your research really stood out to you as signifying the importance of his work?
In the Mauthausen trial, Mauthausen distinguished itself by its quarry, the Wiener Graben. Prisoners emaciated, undernourished, sick, should not have been allowed to work at all, were made to chisel 100-pound stones from the sides of the quarry and carry them up what were known as the steps of death. If any of them made it up without falling, the SS had this game they would play. They'd use a birch tree as a slingshot. They would tie prisoners to the tree and hurl them to their death on the rocks below. In the Dachau trial, the first parent trial, you have Klaus Schilling, who was the recipient of 2 Rockefeller grants for medical research, so world-renowned, who simply could not resist the temptation offered to him by Himmler to set up his laboratory inside the grounds of Camp Dachau, where he gave Schilling 24 or so human guinea pigs every week, and he would infect them with Anopheles mosquitoes and then overdose them to try to find a cure, and hundreds died in this way. Denson could not believe what his eyes saw.
So his first reaction was disbelief.
Total disbelief. Yeah. He said, my worst enemy going into these trials was my own inability to accept that human beings are capable of the depth and scale of horror that I saw. There is footage of Bill Denson in the courtroom at Dachau in 1946-47. By the end of the third parent trial, which was Flossenburg, his body weight had dropped from 168 pounds to 116 pounds. The constant exposure day after day after day to the evidence of these atrocities, the depth and scale of which nothing in his God-fearing Southern young man's mind could possibly sum up, was taking its toll, and he collapsed in court. Most of those convicted in the work of Colonel William Denson in the initial year were hanged. As time went by, U.S. priorities shifted. By 1947, when Russia achieved its first nuclear chain reaction, the enemy was no longer Nazi Germany. And U.S. priorities were not punishing Germans, but winning Germany's allegiance in a united front against the new common enemy, namely Stalin's Red Army, knocking over country after country, sweeping west. So in a series of clandestine, and I want to underline that, it was clandestine changes in verdicts. The U.S. government, as an olive branch to the new German Republic, released all of the imprisoned Nazi war criminals, almost 2,000 men and women, responsible for the worst crimes in history. It was not our finest hour.
What was Colonel Jensen's reaction? How did that affect him when he learned that the sentences were being commuted and the people were being released?
He did not want this to be political expediency. He didn't want history looking back and saying this was a farce, this was just victor's justice. He wanted real due process convictions, and he got them. Unfortunately, politics at the time worked against him. Bill Denson, after the trials ended, went home. He did not know until he read about it in the newspapers that the U.S. government had decided to essentially throw out 2 years of his heartfelt work winning due process convictions against Hitler's henchmen. And for him, it was the worst betrayal of justice imaginable.
I was particularly captivated by your descriptions of the Defense Council because they were, for the most part, American Army officers in the JAG Corps who were assigned to represent Nazis, the people they had been fighting months earlier.
So you have Douglas T. Bates, who was Bill Denson's counterpart, the chief defense lawyer, walking the boards with his team day after day prior to accepting, asking themselves, what's this going to do to our family? What's going to happen when we go back home? And people find out that we were the ones who defended the operators of Hitler's concentration camps. They came to the decision that as men of the law, they had a responsibility to defend not hardened criminals, not torturers and murderers, but the process of law. And they did a damn fine job. I mean, if you read their arguments, and then there's 12,000 pages of trial transcripts, it's awfully impressive how diligently they went about their work. The prosecution brought a charge of common design against the accused, which means not a specific criminal action, but a pattern of behavior that the accused did knowingly participate in operating these camps, which were geared toward the starvation, the torture, the humiliation, and ultimately the murder of prisoners. And by voluntarily staying in these camps, they were guilty of the crimes in the camp itself. Defense took the position that, now wait a minute, what is this common design? Where is this common design? An accused is entitled to know what he's accused of, where it's supposed to have happened, how it was supposed to have happened.
Did they suffer any repercussions as a result of being that tenacious in their defense of the Nazis?
When they went back home, they were branded Nazi lovers. Doug Bates wanted to run for public office. I've seen his office. It's this little 3-story wooden building in Centerville, Tennessee, population 2.5. This lovely little place where he had a law practice prior to the war. When he went back, he lost his practice for the most part, and he wanted to run for public office. He was denied doing that because of what he had done at Dachau, and that's unfair, and that should never have been allowed to happen. He is a shining example of the very thing we were fighting for. We were fighting for the right
Rule of law, due process.
to give people due process and rule of law. So he should be credited for that, not punished.
Have the Dachau trials had an impact on proceedings today? And is there something in these trials that you think would be illuminating and useful for lawyers whose practice is outside the specific arena of war crimes?
In the Dachau trials, the chief prosecutor, Bill Denson, established precedents that are used today in the International Criminal Court and elsewhere, particularly with regard to chain of command. How far down the line can you hold people responsible? There's another impact, however, that is, I believe, equally important, namely to remind men and women in the field of law that they have one of the most important jobs on earth. When I meet people at state bar associations and elsewhere, they often confide a disappointment that when they think about how much time and money they've spent getting where they are, that the rewards are not as great as they thought they were going to be. There's burnout. They wonder if they made the right career choices for themselves. A few have told me they would never recommend to their children that they pursue a career in law. So if someone needs a reminder of the importance of a career in law and what can happen when lawyers and judges, law professors, do not invest themselves in due process of law, just visit the sites of the atrocities. Go to the camps. Right? When Hitler's policies received the endorsement of the legal establishment of Germany, that's when the success of the Nazi Party was guaranteed. So my recommendation for people feeling burnout in their law career, go on the March of the Living. You know, it's a good reminder of how vital a career in law really is.
This is a particularly challenging time for Holocaust awareness. As a Holocaust educator, do you find the Dachau trials important for safeguarding the memory of the Holocaust, and if so, in what ways?
The educational community, the legal community, play a critical role in Holocaust memory because they both deal with that tricky terrain between history as it really was and history as we might like it to have been. Right? And that's the dilemma we face in Holocaust history today, the search for truth at a time when truth itself is being described as fake.
On a daily basis. Yeah.
On a daily basis. It's a time when party politics would erase history in order to bolster a national image or to serve some artistic end. So honest confrontation with memory, not narrow political agendas, is where truth and justice lie.
Well, Joshua, thank you for sitting down with us today. I think I mentioned to you off camera that I had gone on the March of the Living last year for the first time, and I found it to have made the experiments at once more real and at the same time more mystifying. And your book and its riveting descriptions of the conduct that occurred and of the attempts of the lawyers on both sides to try to seek some form of justice just reinforces those conclusions. And I really want to thank you for your time today.
Well, you're very welcome. It's been my pleasure.
I asked him, so clearly the lawyers on both sides in the years afterwards became extremely bitter about the way it was handled. The defense lawyers, obviously, because they were labeled as Nazi sympathizers, even though they hadn't been, and the prosecutor because he saw his work basically scuttled when all the sentences were commuted and the prisoners released. So I asked him, you know, how did those feelings change over time? And interestingly, both sides, both Denson and Bates, came to the conclusion that what was important was the record that they made. And that record was stronger for the fact that it was so hotly contested. When you read the transcripts that are in the book, I mean, there are timely and good objections to everything the prosecution was trying to do. The common design theory was fought out bitterly in every trial, where the defense lawyers were saying, you can't prove any specific incident, so you come up with this common design theory. It's a complete flouting of the whole concept of conspiracy. And they argued it out, and the common design concept held. And so the peace of mind for both sides at the end was the strength of the record that they had built together in opposition to each other. So it's a fascinating book, and I recommend it to those who are interested. American Bar Association publishes it. It's available online. And with that, I think we take a...
We're going to get you a break.
Oh, okay.
As your guide to continue to get credit, we are going to take a 15-minute break. I'd ask, and the coffee's out here. But before you go, I want to, as we continue to ask ourselves And I hate to do this to you on the break, but I want you to ask yourselves again, throughout these processes, where were the lawyers? If you think about what's occurred, just as if you're a government lawyer in the United States and you're faced with the question of, for example, is waterboarding legal? And government lawyers, well-respected lawyers, and people differed about this, wrote memoranda, and we've now seen the memoranda that said, yes, it's justified. So you think about it, and you think about the lawyers who were active in the Third Reich and how they manipulated both the truth and the law to serve the Fuhrer. And that's where the lawyers were. So continue to think about that during our break, and we'll come back and hopefully you'll have some questions for our panel.